I would like to introduce Kia, who's going to be leading off today with spoken word. Kia?
Where should I begin? Let's look deep within. Let's start by recognizing the color of my skin. All my life, I just tried to fit in to a society and a reality whose views were paper thin. And in order to survive, I needed to assimilate. There was no way to thrive, and now it's time to educate. Inspired by revolutionaries recognizing my true wealth, my intention is to navigate a pathway back to self. So let's respectfully review events that have occurred and focus on the facts because the lines are being blurred. I'm tired of all the lip service for the cameras and the press. Let's address the changes needed for the ones who are oppressed. We are allowed to be angry, but I've learned to be smart. Disseminate my message while speaking from my heart, because we need accountability, and that might be a place to start. So I'm asking for transparency, and we all play a part. To deconstruct systemic racism in the systems of care, we need to understand the demographics we compare. Access to the services that are saving lives directly correlates to socioeconomic ties. The industrial prison complex is built with modern-day slaves. Corporate wealth depends on how the lower class behaves, and so it isn't in the interest of the rich to end addiction. Thus, poverty prevails, as do attitudes and convictions. Now, if you haven't seen 13th, you don't belong in the conversation, because it tells me you're not willing to understand incarceration, and we treat addicts like criminals, similar types of humiliation, and we lock them up, contributing to the dehumanization. The countless Black lives lost to police brutality and in jail is the proof of how we failed. And now we must unveil the never-ending cycle of abuse and deprivation that brings me to my knees and has left us in this situation. This is not an old idea. This shit is still transpiring. We still decide whose lives mean more. Our leaders still conspiring. But as I stand up on this stage, a witness to the conniving, I speak in strength with unity about how we're surviving. This is a departure from what is normal, usual, or expected. An articulate Black woman in the past would be rejected. But that is not the case today because we are connected. And the solidarity we embrace now will be respected. We're taking back our culture, language, and our music. Far too long we've sat back and forgiven our abusers. I'm sharing my experience. I'm standing in this light. I'm taking back my power and I'm fighting for my rights. Respecting reconciliation, representing revolution. Joining grassroots movements, seeking restitution, because the time for talk is over. My words now call to action, the collective consciousness of my community's reactions, the vibrancy of our cultures, the beauty of our nations, the knowledge and the wisdom that's been taught for generations. And I'm overcoming obstacles. I'm overcoming fear. And we're rising up resisting all the lies we've heard for years. So what else can I say? What must we discover? Because I'm here before your eyes as proof a Black addict can recover. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Kia. Okay, I'd like to welcome our next presenter, Todd Ware, and the Lived Experience panel. Todd will be introducing everybody on the panel today. Todd will be leading the panel and presenting on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, recovery pathways, equity, intersectionality, and inclusion. Todd, come on up.
Welcome, everyone, today. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge we are on the unceded traditional territory of the Kakite First Nations, and we are on the land of the Coast Salish people. To be with you here today where I started my pathway to recovery, is a great honor. I'd like to thank all who are able to share in this conversation, and I hope you take something today which is valuable and meaningful for yourself. George Dixon of Africville once said he wouldn't fight in certain arenas if blacks weren't allowed to come in and see the event. Well, today, the lovely people here before you, we are the event. In the early 70s in Halifax, my lessons in resistance began. My mother once told me when I was much older, she said, "Todd, I was told I should not adopt a black child in the early 70s and that this was not okay. And here I stand, steadfast in the lived experience of my mother, powerful and deliberate in her movements as she took me home from the first system of care that I was in." Once again, we meet at this intersection in the presence of brilliance, color, culture, and resilience. The pathway forward in recovery may very well be paved with good intentions, but we must account for the narrow, non-existent pathways of the past. When I came into recovery, one of my mentors used to say, "What you live with, you learn. What you learn, you practice. What you practice, you become. And what you become has consequence." No longer in silence, my consequences have changed. My experience is here and now, and what I practice is recovery. Where I once didn't take pride in the skin I'm in, today I do, and I come with a desire to participate in a conversation in hopes of inspiring others. To be truly vibrant, dynamic in our collective attempt to widen recovery pathways for safe, quality education, prevention, harm reduction, and treatment, the lived experiences of persons of color, Black and Indigenous communities need to continue to be brought to the forefront. In the spirit of transparency and inclusion, we don't have everyone here today that I would have wished to, and for that I will account for. With an invitation to share comes great risk, a risk to my friends here to have conversations about their recovery pathways, culture, and community. It's a risk I respect and I stand for and with, unified in purpose. When I met Avis some years ago, I knew she held something strong within her. I could feel it. To me, she is the sound and rhythm of 1,000 beating drums. In her recovery pathway, she helps to diminish shame rooted in colonial history and build strength, healing, and wellness through a connection to land and culture. To be at this place rich in hope, potential, possibility, we recognize the history of division, oppression, violence, hate, and disadvantage within our systems of care. And to take them apart, we need people to tell the truth. When I met my friend Donovan, he brought me the gift of truth. And with truth comes learning. And with new learnings comes new practice. And we can stand up against the disadvantage we face and create new pathways for those yet to join us. We build hope upon hope with dignity and grace. I have witnessed my dear friend Vindy walk her pathway of recovery, drawing on the teachings of her beloved grandmother, and in doing so, allows other women of color to rise up and walk with that same dignity and grace. It is in dignity and grace that we can be empowered and we can be bold. Kevin and I, at times, have walked in unison as we attempt to widen the pathway to recovery within the Black community. Kevin is no longer a number to be counted. He has broken from the chains of institutional living and thus proving the statistics can be changed through a pathway in recovery. We can be angry, we can be passionate, and we can be brave. And know this, we will not be quiet. With spoken words so beautiful, Kia represents the love, the passion, and the courage it takes to be here today on center stage. As the voice, spirit, and lived experience is shared today, let us begin our journey. This thing on? Here we go.
Just yours? No?
I think it's working.
We're on. Mine's on.
We're good.
Hello.
Hello? Hello?
Kevin, what do you find will bring real value in you being here today?
I think numerous different things. Like you said, for somebody like me who's struggled with addictions in institutions for quite some time, going on 15 years, I think that I can bring hope and I can bring awareness to people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, that there is a way to break free from that. The thing, I was getting emotional when you were talking. The thing is that I know I face many barriers trying to access, healthcare and trying to access, recovery avenues to get clean in the first place. And hey, I've been clean 11 years, but I tried recovery 20 something years ago. And, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. And I was pushed out in my sense. I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel welcome. And it was because of the color of my skin. I promise you, that's how I felt, and I have never really talked about that until, recently. I just took it as, I wasn't ready to get clean. And, I was ready to get clean. I believe me, 20 years ago, it was bad. It didn't need to get to where it got to. And, with all of us being here today, it's a way to reach more people, to understand that people of color need to have more of a voice. Our recoveries need to look different. Okay, you understand? People need to understand it needs to look different. It's not the same for everybody. Especially think about like Indigenous folks. Their recovery needs to be so much more connected to culture and land. And I work with so many Indigenous folks, and I see the lack and the gap. And because of that, people are dying. Period. That's it.
Thanks, Kevin. Avis, for you, what's the value for you to be here today?
I think the value that I bring is my experience getting clean at a young age. I came in when I was 20 years old, and I came in at a time where I was born with the privilege of being born into a body with white skin. So I look like a white person, but I embody generations of the impacts of intergenerational impacts of residential schools and colonization and shame that was bred into me from the residential school era. So I got clean at a time when, because I look non-Indigenous, I pretended like I was somebody that I wasn't. And for 2 years in recovery, 2 years into my recovery, I started to feel suicidal. And I was suicidal because I lacked a connection, a positive connection to my identity as a Haida Kwakwaka'wakw woman. And once I started to develop that connection to a positive connection where I started to diminish shame and started to feel positive about who I am and where I come from, the suicidal thoughts went away, the suicidal feelings went away. So I think my experience as an Indigenous woman can bring a lot of value to this conversation.
Thank you. Donovan, for yourself, what's the value for you to be here today with us?
I think it's a hard question to answer, to be honest. I feel like what I bring to any conversation really is this willingness to be vulnerable. I didn't know what that was really, and it was interesting, like how it happened to me, like to be able to speak openly and honestly on a day-to-day basis. There was a time in my life where I was super ashamed to say that I was a user, or that I'd been on the street, or that I'd been to jail for petty crimes. And I kept that all a big secret. And then one day I got invited onto this podcast, and the guy had hundreds of thousands of listeners. And we just had a conversation, and I basically told my whole story. And then it wasn't until after that I found out that, all these people were listening. And what happened was everybody said, that's exactly all we ever wanted from you, was just to be you. So just by being me somehow was enough. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah.
What about for yourself, Vindy?
Thank you for having me here. It's really already nice just to hear a few people talk. And the biggest thing for me for being here, the value I bring is that for so long, like being born into an Indo-Canadian family whose parents immigrated from India in the early 80s and only knew one way, there was definitely from a young age, like two identities formed. Like I was born Canadian with very strong family values. And, you know, like I didn't come into recovery, my chosen path, until I was 29 years old. And I suffered for 10 years because of the shame, which I've heard is just like a reoccurring even theme among all the other panelists here. It was difficult to own my story because of the shame that I carried with it as an Indo-Canadian woman, because even as a male, my father has struggled with addiction for most of his life and he's in his 60s. And it is not a norm to talk about addiction and get the help because of the stigma and stereotype. So as his daughter, as a female, it was just something that was looked down upon. So to really come and ask for that help and have someone ahead of me who was also Indo-Canadian, it made it okay. Still being in recovery, I still carry that shame because it's not fully accepted among my family, and not just my family. I think they've become more accepted because I've helped them evolve, because the willingness is there to want to change and evolve, but there are some very deep-rooted stereotypes and stigma that are still needing a lot of work. So my value is to really open up that conversation and, you know, really smash that stigma around Indo-Canadians and addiction and mental health and trauma. So
Thank you, Vindy. What about yourself, Kia?
Go back to this mic, I guess. All right. I really like what Donovan said about the hope aspect. And I think for me, that's represented in the sense that I can inspire people with what I choose to do with poetry and music. But more importantly, you know, I've walked in that world with professionals for a long time, and the shame is what kept me in my addiction for 20 years. Like there was no way I was gonna come forward as a professional and say, I need any kind of help. And my denial was so deep. Even when I got to treatment, my denial was still so deep that I was not an addict. But I think me being able to take pride in it now and to put that out there in the community has already had repercussions, other professionals reaching out to me and saying, you know, I've been suffering with addiction, but I've been too scared to come forward. So I think that addicts can look in all different ways and we can walk in all different parts of life is also really important to express, that the face of addiction just looks like all of us.
Thank you. So Vindy, I just want to return to the conversation that you opened up, and it seemed to resonate with a lot of you on stage. What could we do to take apart that shame for people? What can we do to allow people to move from that position?
do you mean in a sense of like as a system or just as individuals?
For families and communities,
For
what would be
families.
helpful? Yeah.
I think when I look back, and I really look back at like my father going through his addiction and myself, I think that there just needs to be like a lot of education. There's a lot of barriers. Like my parents' first language was not English. They already have stigma around addiction, so they're not going to go seek out help on their own. So I think that, you know, having these services available in like primary acute, like going to a doctor's office and having that available, whereas they're not seeking that information out because there's already that stigma, they're not going to get the help. So I think that what it needs to happen is that there needs to be treatment and recovery that is culturally sensitive. So taking language, taking values, you know, because what might work for an Indo-Canadian is not going to be the same that works for white Caucasian. So I think just I think the conversation needs to happen. We need to normalize the conversation because the conversations are based around shame, and you know, there's not enough research or people just with lived experience sharing what's going on for them. So no one they're kind of being neglected in my point of view.
Okay, thank you. Avis, who are the people in your life that inspire you down your own pathway to recovery?
I think one of the most important people in my life, and she's not in recovery, she's a member of my family, is my sister. When I was in my addiction, she was there with unconditional love and support, and that's really what I needed as I was finding my way to recovery. I think for a lot of us, and I can just speak from my own experience, I used drugs because I was living with unhealed trauma, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and for a lot of us, we can't living with that trauma without the use of drugs. It's too painful. That's why we use drugs, and so it works as a medication. And so to have people in our lives that can love us until we're ready to live, to face that pain and to deal with that trauma is so important. So I'm really grateful for my sister, just for being there while I was moving to a place where I was ready to face those traumas head on.
Is there things about your sister that would be valuable for everybody out listening to this conversation that we can instill them that would be helpful to support people in their recovery pathway? You spoke a lot about love. What else would be a skill set people could bring in to be truly supportive?
I think empathy and compassion. I think those are really the most two important things, is having empathy and compassion for people while they're in that pain, because people are dying. People are dying right now because that trauma that they're living with is too intense and they can't live without drugs. So having empathy and compassion for people until they reach that place. Yeah, I think that's really important.
Okay. What about for yourself, Donovan? Who inspires your story?
Well, actually, like it was when I first started this journey of sobriety in 2006, I really thought that it was just like I just had so much trust issues and I couldn't have people in my life, and it was just super lonely and I didn't have anything. So I went to one place and then I ended up getting kicked out. But when I came out here to New West, there was a bunch of guys that were getting sober, and it was no one in particular that really inspired me. It was just that I was seeing guys that were coming off the street and they were taking all sorts of different paths. You know, it wasn't like they were that person that I knew from the street. They were like a carpenter or a boyfriend. They became husbands. And so it was really just the peers around me, you know, like I don't have a family much to speak of or like a big group of friends, but I'm connected to everybody in a lot of ways. So I've always just looked to the people around me for the potential and possibility of my life, you know? Because in the beginning, I really didn't know, like, what do you do once you stop doing drugs? What do you do when you stop being homeless? And so it was like, you know, seeing my peers, the guys that I was getting sober with, and the women getting apartments and going on trips and having kids, and because I couldn't even think of those things like from where I was coming from, like having an apartment or having a relationship with somebody. You know, I'd never seen anything like that. So, you know, I would say that that's been the greatest inspiration, is just the people around me. You know, I've always been that guy that's been around, and I'm just observing everything that's going on at all times. And when I see stuff that's interesting, it's just like going to that person and seeing like, how did you do that? You know, I want to be a part of that. And I guess that's a gift of this community in general, is that it's so vast. Like, so yeah, it's been really my inspiration has been my peers for sure.
Thank you. Kevin, what about yourself?
I think when I first got clean this last time, I think my biggest inspiration was probably my mom. She was somebody who stuck by me through everything, and I have a lot of respect and love for my mom. She's somebody who was married to a black man in the 70s in Canada, which was, from when I look back on it now, must have been really hard. You know what I mean? I remember walking to the grocery store with my mom, and my mom is white, my dad is black, and people looking at us really strange. You know what I mean? Like looking at my mom like, whose kid do you have? You know what I mean? And my mom was somebody who never turned her back on me ever. When I was in the streets, my mom would come down there looking for me. I would hear on the streets, hey, there's some little small white lady looking for you down by Main and Hastings. And I'd be like, oh, you know what I mean? And then I'd go down there and it'd be my mom, right? And not an undercover police officer or something, you know? And so my mom really inspired me to want to stay clean for her. And I have some children and some older children, and now it's definitely a combination of, it's probably my family that keep me inspired, and also you know, people like Donovan. Like when I first got clean, like I was probably 30 days clean, and I seen Donovan clean, and I know Donovan from back then, and just seeing him clean, like I could basically, like I couldn't even understand how he was a number of years clean. Like that didn't make sense to me, right? So like Donovan was saying, like, what did I do? I asked him questions like, hey, like, you know, how did you do this thing? And he showed me, and I know for a fact I wouldn't be clean to this day if it wasn't for Donovan and numerous other individuals, but him for sure. I will never forget the things that he did for me when I first got clean. And also there was another certain person in the treatment center that I ended up walking into, and he was a guy that I went to high school with, and I remember, you know, we were in school together, we were hanging out, and then I remember, you know, all of a sudden he was gone, you know what I mean? And he got this long 15-year sentence, and like he did every day of that sentence. And when he got out, he was also like a year or two clean, and that just blew my mind, you know? And like he wasn't on parole, he wasn't on probation, they weren't telling him he had to get clean, like he just wanted to get clean. So, you know, people inspire me, and it's family, and it's people that have the same similar story that I have that touch my heart and give me strength.
Thank you, Kevin. Kia, for yourself?
Well, I'm quite new into my recovery. I've just taken a year, and so I would say the same as Donovan. It's the peers and the people in this community. Even maybe Todd, since I was scared of him doing relapse prevention. I'd be like, oh, I better not say the wrong thing. But you know, it's the women in the room too. Gail, Leanne, Patricia, my counselor at the treatment center I went to. She was the first person that looked me in the eye and said, I see you, you're an addict. And I was like, what do you mean? Like I'd fooled people. I thought I had fooled people for so long, but to have somebody like just look me dead straight in the eyes and just call it, just I gave that made me fold. and for that reason, somebody that could actually see Kia through all the layers and all the masks and all the lies, that really inspired me to seek out and to listen to the people. And yeah, this community in New West is amazing. I mean, I moved to this community shortly after leaving the treatment center, because I loved the energy of the people and the support that you see on a daily basis. And so there's something special here, and I think that it's showing that people can recover, but it's holding each other up and holding each other accountable, and showing each other the way, the path forward. So.
Thank you. So for all of you, and I'll just put this out here, and feel free to jump in whenever you would like, how will we hold more space for these types of conversations moving forward?
I think that, you know, for people of color, I don't really know, like, I don't know who makes the decisions on how care changes and who signs these papers on whether these certain, you know, like you were saying, culturally sensitive treatment centers or recovery avenues open up for people. I don't know who signs those papers, but I know who needs to tell these people how these systems need to change. It's people like us. You know what I mean? And I don't really know, other than what we're doing right now, this is how we get it out there. You know what I mean? This is how we make people aware. You know, I'm hoping this can be streamed by, you know, however many people are watching, and then restreamed, and then people can understand that, you know, these conversations need to be had. Like, there's no joke about what's happening in this, in let's say North America right now with people of color. Like, it's absolute tragedy. Yeah, I've been emotional for the past 3 months. Like, I can't even watch TV. I can't even turn on my phone. It's unbearable to watch. And it reflects on my own experience as to how I ended up the way I was. You know what I mean? My trauma is basically just being Black in Canada. You know what I mean? And I struggled. And we need to just be heard and keep talking and get vulnerable and be honest and not be afraid to let people know. And we need to just keep talking, and people need to start listening.
I agree with, sorry, it's Mike, right? Kevin. I agree with Kevin. I think this is like the first step is having the conversation. And I think the second step definitely is like really taking a look from these lived experiences of like what we've been doing, and what's working and what's not working. Because I think that clearly if people are still like of color, Indigenous, you know, Black people are still feeling this type of racism and shame, there's a lot of work still that needs to be done. And I can say that from my experience because I still feel that way. And I know a lot of people who, since I've been in recovery, have reached out to me and they'll take that step, but they don't complete that step. There's a gap. There's a gap there that is a barrier in accessing this help. So I think a lot of it does have to do with creating space, which is safe for others to, you know, access and reach and talk about without any like racism or, you know, prejudice. So people actually can come out and share their story and share their truth and not feel shame around it or uncomfortable.
Okay.
I got something else on that too, though. I think it has to come from the top down as well, right? We're having this conversation, we've been having this conversation, but when we look at the systems of power, the people that hold the top seats are usually all white people. Like, let's just be real about that, right? It's like not, there might be the token Black person or the token Indigenous person that gets hired to work at that particular facility, right? And we know that we need to check off all the boxes and have a certain representation, but usually the people that are making the decisions are the white people. And that's an uncomfortable conversation to have if you're the Black person. But I think that until we start to look at the people making the actual change, being of representation and being of lived experience, not just a token Black person that's not an addict, that doesn't check the box, right? I mean, what does that do? But actually having the people in positions of power with the representation and lived experience. And I think that starts by having those white people recognizing their own biases in the conversation, right? And it's okay to say, I need to know more. I don't understand what that looks like. I don't understand how my own thinking, because the white people are also have been brought up in this system as well. And I don't mean to just say it like that, but we have all learned this system of racism. So it's unlearning for everybody, not just, oh, you're racist or you need to change. It's like, no, how do you unpack the things that you've been taught and have been passed down for these multiple generations? So once people can kind of have that conversation and get comfortable with what their own biases are and where those came from and whether they came from family or whether they came from their work, whether they came from their education system, then we can talk, right? We can't talk if people are still pretending that nothing's wrong, which I think is what's happening. So.
I just want to add on that, like, I agree, like, I have prior to coming and choosing this path of recovery, I've been in detox 10 times. Like, I've been through other treatment facilities, and never did I see person of my color there for me to connect with. Like, even though I am Canadian, but I'm also Indo-Canadian. So like what Kia just said, the system of care, I can never walk in and feel instantly connected. So, and that just comes with what you said. I feel like there needs to be, and even if there was not a person of color, it would be beneficial to have education, like culture sensitivity on Sikhism or Black or Indigenous. So it's comfortable for people to come show up and feel like they have something to connect with, and they're not just gonna show up and then unlearn what they know and learn something new, because they have their own cultural stuff that they still need to figure out and work through the shame and all that. So I just wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, I can just add to that. I was working for a youth restorative justice treatment program, and really early on in my employment, my manager, who was a highly educated white non-Indigenous woman, recognized that I had this skill set. And 40% of the kids in our program are Indigenous. So she wrote to our funders, and she found the funding to create a position for me so that I could facilitate land-based cultural empowerment facilitation for these young kids in this restorative justice treatment program. And the benefit that I seen similar to my experience, these young Indigenous kids come into this program ashamed, no connection to land, no connection to culture. And I got to facilitate these empowering, like taking them out on the land, teaching them about drumming and singing and dancing and traditional plant medicine harvesting. And I just watched these kids, their spirits come alive, and it was the most beautiful thing. And that didn't happen because I chose that. That happened because a highly educated white person said, hey, this is important. We need to change this. And they found the funding for it. So I think it really does need to come from the top.
I think, like, in order to have conversations like this, so much more needs to be done around teaching people how to communicate nonviolently. Right now, the way that things are, it seems like everything just, because everything is really, really bad, that there's just a lot of screaming going on. People, their face gets all messed up, and everything that's just coming out is just very sharp. And so everybody's just kind of shutting down, because as soon as they're being met with a sort of like a mean face or that tone, it's just the conversation is over. So like at a real fundamental level, we need to be learning nonviolent communication, like immediately, like teaching the kids that, teaching that in treatment centers and all the way up to the top, because that's really what's gonna heal us. It's not gonna be like, we can yell all we want about things that are wrong. It's like when you get really quiet and you say less, and you can say, you don't have to be mad. You don't even have to be upset about what's happening right now, because we all know it's terrible. So we can kind of move past that. So I know that for me, the work that I did around nonviolent communication, meditation, has helped me just internally too, like when stuff's come up, to like not meet it with so much aggression, but to be able to say, okay, this is this and that's that, and I don't need to add on anything to it to make it worse, if that makes any sense, but it definitely has to be a top-down thing too, like where on a political level that there's somebody speaking for us in city council and at the government level too. Like, I don't know about what that looks like as having a member of parliament, but there definitely needs to be a voice all the way up, because this thing that we've been dealing with for ever, like this has been going on forever, isn't going away, and it's definitely not getting any better. So, you know, I think by having a representative at a provincial and even at a federal level is going to really help too. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'll put another question out to all of you. So picture this. And not that, you know, any of you are old except for maybe Kevin. If we took a group of young people, our next generation of young people, and we sat them here on the stage with us, what is the conversation we would like to have with them about education, about what's going on in our world right now, and how to gain a pathway to recovery? What would we want to say to them?
Well, I think for, you know, like when you're talking to kids, when you're talking to anybody, you talk to them exactly like they're a human being. First off, like it's like when you know, when people do that thing again with their face, hey, like get down on their level. It's not about getting down on kids' levels. It's like just talking to them as human beings, and really being super careful about not instilling any of that stigma into them, because we can try like to teach somebody about like about stigma, but in doing that, by the way that you talk to them, you can actually reinforce that stigma depending on how it's said. So it's like, it's a really touchy thing, because, you know, like by teaching a young person something, they could leave the space and then, yeah, drugs are bad. And then it's like, we didn't make any headway, right? Because it's not drugs are bad. So I think it's really important to, like, I don't know how to really articulate this that well, but to talk to them as human beings, but to just make sure that that it's neither good or bad. It's just, this is something like, this is just something that we have to deal with, you know? I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
I'd like to add on that. Now
Yeah.
that you got the conversation going. Like, I'm thinking about future generations. Like, if I have kids, where I think, like, where I suffered the most is when my parents would have conversations. We didn't talk about mental health. We didn't talk about addiction. We didn't talk about trauma. I very well remember, actually, when I had my cousin come facilitate with my parents that, like, I think she has a problem. My dad looked at me and said, yeah, not in our culture. Women don't do that. You're not an addict. So kind of like what Donovan said, it's like instantly I was shut down. Like, this doesn't happen. You're gonna just use sheer willpower and you're gonna get through this. And that's that. So if I was to sit down with future generation of Indo-Canadians or anyone of color, I would have conversation where I normalize mental health, where I normalize addiction. You know, because with my dad saying that to me, it told me that brown woman does not have addiction, and also culturally it's not something that is accepted. So instantly I was shut down and shamed, and because of that I suffered for so much longer. And so, you know, if I have kids down the road or any young person that reaches out to me, I'm like, it's okay. Like, it's okay. Like, let's talk about this. Let's talk about your feelings. You know, it's not because, you know, you're brown or you're black or whatever it is. And really not imposing really deep rooted beliefs on them. Like, come on, we're moving forward. We're living in present day, like, you know, equality. Let's talk about that. Let's not shame our kids. Let's not shame our future, and like have this dialogue going.
Thank you.
I really like what Donovan was saying about speaking to youth at a respectful level and respectful communication. I think that I work with youth in a sense where usually they're in a very emotional state. They're in a very heightened state. They're in the midst of their addiction. And I think that teaching the ability to understand feelings and to, like you said, to normalize that conversation around trauma and to normalize what are the feelings, like teaching them to articulate feelings, and also just that art of meditation and to kind of find the calmness before they want to engage in a solution in any kind of conversation. I know that that's been incredibly helpful for me to deal with a lot of my anger and to deal with a lot of my sadness. But you know, if we can maybe instill the spiritual principles, not the religion, instill the understanding of compassion and empathy for each other as people rather than particular races, then maybe the young people will be able to just respect each other a bit better. You know, I think that just comes down to respect and communication and compassion. But I really like what Vindy was saying about the normalization of conversations around addiction, mental health. I suffered with a lot of mental health issues my whole life. And, you know, up until getting asked to do this panel, I didn't really think about the effect of racism on how it affected my addiction. Like, I actually didn't really think about it. I was like, oh, shit. Maybe I shouldn't swear on a panel on Zoom, but I actually hadn't put those things together until you asked me to sit on this panel and said, that's why I didn't feel like I belonged. That's why I felt like I was always not a part of. A lot of it was really rooted in the racism I felt. And when I think about my own family, I never had a single discussion with my dad about the effects of racism. We moved from England in the 80s in hindsight because my parents were trying to escape racism in England. My mother's white, my dad is black. We moved to the other side of the world in a white community and assimilated, and then never spoke of the racism that my father felt his whole time growing up as a professional here, but also the racism that happened within our own family. Like my grandfather wouldn't even meet my dad because he was black. Until I was born, he never even met the man. And so the fact that I could go 45 years and not have that conversation with my own parents, those are the ways that we can kind of change that generation growing up, right?
I know for me too, like I was adopted out when I was 7. And so I was right on the edge of like the heavy residential school stuff. Like my mom, definitely her suicide was connected to being a part of that, and my grandmother. And what's been really interesting for me in the last couple of years is that what the government did to me was perfect. Like they took me from my community and then adopted me out to a non-Indigenous family. So I didn't even know at a certain point, like up until about 4 years ago, that what I've experienced in addiction has been all racism. You know, like I always just thought that I was a bad kid. But what's been really interesting is like in the last, I've been sober for the better part of 12 years, with a couple things, breakers in there. But most importantly, I stopped doing crime. So I got, these cops came at me one day. I was walking through a neighborhood on Fraser, and then I just got jacked up for no reason. And that was the first time that I ever realized that, like I'm not white. It's like I'm not, it's not even that I'm not white, it's that I'm not a bad person. I was just so used to having so much secrets that when bad things were happening to me, I just assumed everyone knew I was doing bad stuff. So I was like, oh yeah, you're right. I'm a bad person. So, you know, having had this huge transformation the last 15 years from, you know, being homeless, drug dependent, criminal, to not doing that, and then living a life of, you know, what I would consider, like, you know, I think it's safe to say I'm a good person, you know, like there's nothing I can't talk about today with you. Like if you ask, you know, I'm an open book like that. But yeah, so it's a huge problem when you don't even know that that's part of the problem. You know, like my run-in addiction is definitely deep rooted in that in that um, in that trauma from being taken away from my community, not knowing who I am, you know? And I'm 44 years old. I'm just figuring it out now. Yeah. 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 And like nobody can expedite that lesson for me either. You know, this is the thing, is that I'm just learning that this year. So it's hard to think about teaching other people stuff when you don't even know it your own self yet, you know? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a new-ish mom. My daughter's 3, and the most important thing for me in being a parent is breaking the cycle of intergenerational trauma. And so my daughter is the first one in our family in many generations who's growing up in a clean and sober home. You know, the smell of alcohol and cigarettes and addiction is not a part of her life, and she's growing up with a positive connection. She's spending time in her culture. She has regalia. She knows her Kwakwa name. She knows her Haida name. She knows who she is, and she is the first one in our family who that cycle has been broken. And a lot of the work that I do with Indigenous kids, land-based cultural empowerment facilitation, is helping to instill a positive connection to their identity through a connection to culture. So how do we feel good about ourselves when we look at Indigenous people and all we see is the negative stereotypes? Because that was my experience. I looked at Indigenous people and I seen poverty and alcoholism and like reserves with messy houses, and I had nothing but negative associations. And once I started to develop positive associations with Indigenous people, then I'm like, hey, there's actually beautiful parts that I can connect with. So that's the work that I do with young Indigenous people, and the message that I always try to instill is feeling good about who we are and where we come from.
I think the way that I like to approach youth is it varies, right? It all depends on if I can get a sense of where that youth is at. So I just try to take my experience, because I started with addiction and stuff when I was pretty young. So, and if I see it starting out with youth, I just try to bring awareness around drugs and alcohol, safety issues around drugs and alcohol. Break the stigma around using drugs and alcohol is bad. Rather than send youth off into a closet using, let's bring it out and let's let them be safe until it gets bad for them, and or they do want to seek some type of help. At least if they're safe and they're alive, they can get some treatment. You know what I mean? And I think that's super important, because you look at the streets, there's a lot of young people passing away. You know what I mean? And you'll see it on the news. You'll see 14-year-old kid, blah blah blah. Yeah, that's absolutely because this kid is scared to tell his mom, or he's scared to tell his friend that he's doing this poison drug supply that's out there, and they just find him, and it's too late. I also have children, so I have 2 older children and I have 2 small newer children. And with my older children, like both of those kids see me use, you know what I mean? and it wasn't pretty. But once I was able to get on a better path, you know, thank God those kids don't have a resentment and have some understanding around addiction themselves, just being, you know, smart kids, I guess, and understanding. They were open to the conversations about what it looks like to do drugs. You know, it's a choice. You know, if you want to do it, you know, that's your choice. But let's be aware of what can happen. And you know, now I have, Gabe was saying, I have 2 small children that, you know, God willing, they'll never have to see me abuse drugs or alcohol or anything like that. And I just think that it's important, like, you know, like, hey, when we go, like, these people are taking over, right? You know what I mean? And if we don't instill some good values and some positive stereotypes, like, that's another thing is I always tell kids, you know, find some people that are positive that you can look up to and that you want to be like. You know what I mean? And like, not just one, but like a group, anything, you know what I mean? Because when I was growing up, once I started on a negative path, I looked up to criminals. You know what I mean? You know, and where did that get me, right? You know, I see these, I'm a huge sports fan, I know Todd is too, and you know, thank God we like the same teams, or else, you know, it could get ugly on social media, but it doesn't. So I'm saying, you know, I like to use sports in so many different ways, and those folks have such a huge platform, you know, like we do as well, to get the word out about awareness around all different types of stuff, that I really encourage youth to look at people that have that platform, that have that voice, to find positive things that they can learn from them. And that's what I try to instill in them.
Thank you. So for all of you, to be resilient, what part of you is the strongest part of you that you would like to help people move forward with on their recovery pathway? Strongest part of you that allows you to be truly resilient.
I can just go again since talking a lot. I just think that for somebody like me, it's just not giving up. You know, so I remember when my first year recovery, when I had this celebration, and what we talked about at that particular meeting was perseverance. You know, and for somebody like me, a person of color, I persevered through the addiction, being Black, which is tough. And then once I got clean, you know, I persevered through that, and I've persevered through numerous different situations as a person in recovery that I've seen. Hey, I've seen people tie their shoelaces and then break and then run out and, you know, get some dope. You know what I mean? That we're in recovery. Like, it doesn't, not necessarily saying the shoelace was the reason why they choose to go out and get high, but the thing is that it's not easy to be on this journey with everything that goes on, with all the trauma that you carry, with everything that's, you know, going on for folks. So with some of the things that I've been through, I've lost dozens and dozens of people, and I've lost family members, and I've been able to persevere. So I just tell people, just never give up. And if you have chosen to get clean and go on an abstinence path, usually picking up a substance that got you to that shitty place in the beginning is not the answer. So just keep fighting. You know what I mean? Reach out, chat.
Thanks, Kevin. So I've been just notified we've got just a little under a minute and a half. Then we're actually going to take some questions from the audience at home. So who, just in a couple of quick seconds, to be resilient?
Yeah, sure, I can go. So I think when I think back to getting sober when I was 21 years old, I think one of the things that I wish that I had more access to in the institutions that I was in was the understanding and the education around addiction as a form of medication. And I live with PTSD. I've been clean for 13 years. And I struggle immensely with my mental health. You know, using drugs was incredibly traumatic, and I live with PTSD. Thankfully, I haven't needed to medicate that mental illness with drugs in a very long time, but it still exists. And so I think that earlier on, we can teach people and have that education around addiction is a form of medicating ourselves. And so I think my strongest resilience is all of the education I have today. And then also that, that connection I have to the land, to my ancestors, and the positive connection that I have to my identity.
Thank you. So Jared, at this time, are we going to take some?
We are going to go into some Q&A here. So the questions are going to be coming up on the screen here. I'm going to start with a question here, though. So I noticed that the panel today used words like clean, sober, and addict. Now, not everybody identifies that way, but could the panel please tell me what those words mean to them?
I can go. For me, like, this is my chosen path. When I say that I'm a recovering addict, basically I live my life like abstinence free. That's my chosen path. There's many pathways to recovery, but when I specifically say clean or sober, I'm referring to that I live a life substance free, and that works for me.
For me, it's also the same. That's just my path. Like, I'm a 100% huge advocate for whatever chosen path of recovery you need. I actually work in harm reduction. I've been doing it for 8 years, and I'm just massively out there for folks to, hey, let's not judge. You know what I mean? Nobody's ready to get clean and ready to be abstinent, maybe ever. You know what I mean? But if somebody is gonna need some form of medication to make their life better, then that's absolutely recovery as well. You know what I mean? I know people who use different forms of recovery to make their lives better, and that doesn't mean doesn't have to mean abstinence. You know, that's just for me, considering that I've gone this far without it, so I just figure I don't need anything now.
My clean date is really connected to the day I got off the street, the day I stopped shooting drugs, the day I stopped selling my body for drugs, the day I changed my life. That's what my clean date is connected to.
I also identify with an abstinence base. Clean to me means substance free. And I think that just comes from the understanding for myself that that's what I need on this journey.
Okay, got a couple more questions. So here's the first one. How do we, in practical terms, remove the barriers that prevent people from accessing all available resources for support in recovery?
George, that's a great question. I think the access to care is the piece that I would like to have access, like the Portugal model that Giuseppe has shared with us, where people do not have to pay to get help from addiction, and that access is available to everybody. That's one of the most practical things that I could see as a step forward, so that it is at least the economics that is taken away from the picture with people seeking recovery, and on that way we can address all of the races, because I think that, you know, the economics is directly related and associated with those types of barriers that come.
I think one thing I can speak to is that I'm really passionate about right now is the opioid pandemic and the importance of providing a clean supply of drugs to people. The methadone maintenance program worked for me, and I think that providing people with a clean supply of drugs to save lives is one practical thing that we can do to allow people, because that's what worked for me. I couldn't stop using heroin on my own, so I needed to get on methadone. Methadone allowed me to get into treatment, and that's what allowed me to access services. So I think that's one thing that we can do, is provide a clean supply of drugs to addicts.
I think, just to echo what Avis just said, that's something that, in my opinion, has to happen 100% with the clean supply. There's a poisoning going on. It's been happening since, 2014, 2015. We lost thousands and thousands. We've lost more people in the last few months than ever, you know, since this thing started. And if people don't understand that, you know, that we need to let people access a clean supply. Not everybody wants to be on methadone. Not everybody wants to be on Suboxone. You know what I mean? So if we're not going to give people another option to figure out their stuff, then we're just going to keep losing people. And it is that there it is. It's our youth. It's our moms. It's our dads. It's everybody right now.
Okay, next question. Some people I know view themselves as being a non-functioning addict or a functioning addict. They say what makes the difference is having purpose. This to me suggests, just shut up on me. This to me suggests that one can be in recovery functionally, but also identify as being an active addict. So it may not be the recovery addiction dichotomy. Any thoughts on this?
Well, I'll just jump in right away and say that I used to think of myself as a functioning addict, and I don't really think that there is such a thing. I think that's kind of a lie that we tell ourselves. At least that's my experience. Yeah, that's all I'm gonna say.
It makes me think of, I mean, I'm not on methadone anymore, but it makes me think of the women that I have in my life who are still on Suboxone, 15 years later, but are amazing mothers. They're functioning members of society, and doesn't, just because they're on an opioid replacement, they're still incredible people doing incredible things in the world. So that's the thought I have on that.
Okay, next question. As allies, what training is available to enhance our education about intersectionality?
I'm not really sure what training is available, but I definitely share my opinion on what I think kind of training would be available. Is that on a grand scale level, and even on like primary acute, I feel like there definitely should be education starting with employees and staff and all that on cultural sensitivities and training, so that when anybody wants to access these services, those barriers don't stop them from accessing these services. So I feel like that's where the training should begin.
A lot of the advocacy that I've done in some of my work is really advocating for decolonization training and anti-racism training, and really advocating for people of color and Indigenous voices to be heard. So just for an example, like reconciliation, it's not up to a non-Indigenous person to say what reconciliation is. It's now time to listen to what Indigenous people's views are about reconciliation. So I really advocate for training around decolonization and anti-racism training, and really allowing for our voices to be heard.
Yeah, I'll just echo that as well. And I think this training needs to be done by people of color, not white people.
Okay, so is the current opiate epidemic increasing the conversation and reducing the stigma of addiction?
Donovan, you want to take that one on?
Is the current opiate epidemic increasing the conversation and reducing the stigma? I don't know. It doesn't seem like much is changing, to be honest. The amount of, like, it's been interesting watching this thing happen with COVID, and like immediately when a certain section of people are going to be affected potentially, then the government just frees up money and resources and all this is available. But this whole time, more people have been dying by who knows what the numbers. Anybody know what the numbers are? It's got to be like 10 times as many people died from the opiate epidemic during COVID than in people in COVID. So, it seems like whatever is being done is definitely not enough there needs to be more being done by the government to, like the same conversation like Dr. Henry should be doing every day on the opiate thing. If there's that many people dying, right? Like, why aren't they putting the same kind of energy into the opiate crisis as COVID? Does that make sense?
It does. We're gonna go to the next question. Any of the panelists, would you mind sharing what your barriers were to accessing treatment?
Lack of funding, trying to get referrals, not feeling comfortable with the doctor asking different types of questions about, you know, my nationality. Just me thinking about, why would you be asking me questions about my nationality? What difference does that make? You know what I mean? I'm just here seeking treatment. There's different types of barriers. The main ones I think are when you try to access a service, there's so many hoops to jump through. You know, you think about just before you can get to treatment, like they ask you to go to a detox center. Try getting into a detox center in Vancouver. It's not easy. You know what I mean? And for the many people that are using drugs and alcohol in Vancouver or Lower Mainland, there's this fraction of detox beds. I can't even fathom think about, why is there so little detox beds? But so I can't get into treatment if I can't go to detox, but I can't get into detox. So by that time, I'm just back to the street. So that's a huge barrier.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. Todd, do you want to wrap up the panel?
Again, I want to thank and acknowledge the courage, strength, and desire for each and every one of you to come here today. I want to thank everyone who made this happen and everyone who believes in Black, Indigenous, and persons of color as our pathways open up. To all of you who stand in solidarity, do accountable work, and support change, I applaud and thank you. Continue to be radical, continue to move forward, and never let anyone extinguish your flame. True value is in the heart of lived experience, but not when it is silenced. Bring your voice, speak loudly, and we will continue to take apart our systems of care and create a diverse community. And when we meet at this intersection again, we will continue to stand united as Black, Indigenous, and persons of color find our way. In closing, I have invited Leanne and Jessica to lead us out. Power to the people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Todd and the entire panel today. That was fantastic. Thank you guys very much for coming. Really appreciate it. I just want to remind everybody we're going into a break now, so please visit the virtual exhibitor booths. They're giving away free stuff and some free swag. Also remind everybody to join on the WOVA app. There's a community section at the very bottom. Go and join it. There's over 1,600 conversations happening right now on that app. So thank you again, guys. Thank you very much.